This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. The series is currently accepting proposals across the disciplinary range of animal studies and critical animal studies, and that includes monographs, edited collections, and other kinds of scholarly work. If you're looking for a publisher, do consider reaching out to the series editors. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Nathan Poirier. Nathan is an interdisciplinary critical animal studies scholar with a background in anthrozoology, sociology, and mathematics. He currently teaches at Lansing Community College in Michigan. He's the co-editor of the 2022 collection Emerging New Voices in Critical Animal Studies, Vegan Studies for Total Liberation, the 2023 collection Expanding the Critical Animal Studies Imagination, Essays in Solidarity and Total Liberation, and of the 2024 collection Veganarchism, Making Veganism and Anarchism Dangerous Again. Today, however, we're going to talk about the 2025 Lantern Publishing collection Exploring Topics in Non-Human Coexistence, Passion, Praxis and Presence, which Nathan co-edited with Sarah Tomasello, Erin Jones and Mark Sahida. In particular, we're going to dig into one of Nathan's chapters, Veganism as an Overlooked Component of Anarchafeminism. Welcome to the podcast, Nathan.
Yes, hi Josh. Thank you very much for having me.
Could you start by telling us how this book came about?
Yeah, so this book I like the origin story of. So when Sarah and I, with Amber George, did the Expanding the Critical Animal Studies Imagination book, when we put out the call for that, we got a lot of response. We got like some 40 or so responses from that. So we decided to do two books. One of them was Expanding the CAS Imagination, and then we split a number of chapters into what became Exploring Topics in Coexistence. The submissions seemed to divide themselves kind of nicely, so that seemed to make sense. So we pursued two totally separate books rather than doing something that's like a 2-volume work. We wanted them to be their own thing because that's what submissions seem to lend themselves to. And so one of the particularly nice things about that was at the time, so this goes back to 2022 when we were starting these, Sarah and I had collaborated multiple times. And so with Expanding the CAS Imagination, my name went first on that one. And so with the second book, since we had two, with the two of us in particular, Sarah's name could go first on the Coexistence book.
In the book's introduction, you talk about this idea of non-interference as a guiding theme. What do you mean by that, and how does it show itself in the different chapters?
Yeah, so non-interference was something that I had been, I suppose, wrestling with for a few years. One thing that I had noticed was every time I would talk about it to people, every time I would insert it in a school paper, every time someone would point it out and basically say, this isn't feasible. That was like a universal reaction. And I never thought that I was explaining it in a way that was somehow offensive. And so that just always struck me as somehow off base or even tone deaf. I don't exactly know how to describe it, but I never trusted these reactions from people. But partly because of that, I never formulated something for publication on that topic. So when the introduction for this book came around, I thought, hey, I've got these various pieces of writing on this topic that's never been actually put together. Why don't I put it together here? That seems to go with this theme of coexistence as far as I'm concerned. And so the idea was to lay this out in the beginning as kind of a foundation for non-human coexistence. Is look, the one of the best ways we actually might be able to coexist with non-humans is to leave them alone. And so I wanted to put that out there and kind of make people confront this rather than have it exist in my mind in unpublished writings. I wanted to put that out there, see how it might be reacted to when it's a little bit more fleshed out and put in some context. So now I'm trying to think of how that kind of runs through the chapters. I certainly think in terms of chapters that discuss veganism, which is quite a few, some much more direct than others, some don't discuss veganism really, and that's fine. But of those that do, is I would view veganism as a way of leaving non-human animals alone, to not eat them, right? Not confine them, not farm them, not otherwise put them to work, not harm them in terms of getting other products from them. So all of that I see as ways of leaving them alone. And I see of how leaving non-humans alone could lead to animal liberation because of things like that. So many harms, I think, could just be stopped if humans did that. So I think that is a theme that runs clear enough through the chapters if one reads them, but particularly in terms of just thinking about how we would not use them or not harm non-human animals.
Now, I wouldn't ask an editor to pick a favourite chapter, but I wondered if you could introduce us to a few of the chapters that are in the volume, and perhaps also the sort of disciplinary spread that we have in the text.
Yeah, so the disciplinary spread runs all over the place, and that's something I really enjoy in edited collections. And so that's something I've found out that people tend to not like in edited collections, which really shocks me, including publishers. So Lantern was very nice in being accepting of that. They didn't have a problem, so that was wonderful. Darren Chang has a chapter on multi-species justice, and that was wonderful because that was a framework I hadn't heard of before. So reading about it from Darren is it's basically an intro. It kind of works that way because Darren lays that out as a framework to use for non-human, so non/human liberation. So for both humans and non-humans, I thought that was a great topic of bringing everyone together. And that's what we wanted in the non-human, the non/human, awkward to say, but that's intentional word and phrasing that we were using in this book. So Varun Joshi, he's a friend of mine. So he was someone that I was going to work with in the 2022 book of the Emerging New Voices in Critical Animal Studies, but we weren't able to make a chapter happen at that time. So I came back to him for another opportunity, and it was able to work. So I was really happy to come back and work with Varun that way and include his chapter. Varun writes about cow protectionism in India. And that's a pretty interesting story for people who don't really know what's going on with that situation over there. And I didn't, at least not like some of the specifics that Varun lays out. And so while cow protectionism might sound very nice and the vegetarianism might sound very nice over there, within the context of cow protectionism, Varun actually exposes a lot of social injustice and a lot of harm to humans and non-humans over cow protectionism. So that's kind of a great expose, in a sense, of a term in a situation that could easily be misconstrued by outsiders, and Varun can help bring that perspective to people who aren't familiar with India. Sarah May has a chapter in there about teaching critical animal studies, and that is a phenomenal autoethnography. Yeah, so that's a chapter about her experiences teaching that to graduate students. So introducing graduate students to critical animal studies in particular for the first time. So even though the context that she writes about teaching in is very familiar to me because it's from Canisius University. Sarah May and I both went there similar times. I took the critical animal studies through that university, and that's her context. So I'm kind of aware of how people can accept or not critical animal studies when confronted with that. And so that's what she's talking about. And really she's struggling with it. And that's very clear. That is not something she hides. So she is working out her struggles, not only talking about them, but continuing to work it out. And you really get this intense, emotional, passionate internal dialogue that is becoming external through the chapter. And Sarah May just does a really good job about how to handle difficult topics with people who are more or less receptive to it.
Well, that's fantastic. And I know there's lots of other chapters, but I do want to turn to your chapter, or one of your chapters in particular, and that's your chapter on anarchafeminism. You're building on accounts of anarchafeminism, especially the work of Chiara Battici. So could you introduce us to this tradition of anarchafeminism, both generally and indeed as theorized by Battici?
I mean, I can do that, but lots of other people can do that. And I think so in general, it's best, people seek out their own sources, especially with a topic like this, rather than take anything from me as particularly true. But so anarcho-feminism, how I understand it, generally arose as a bit of an undercurrent to what we might call mainstream anarchism. So mainstream anarchism is typically associated with focusing on states, nationalized entities, or things like the workplace and what we might call capitalism, even if it didn't always maybe at first arise with that sort of terminology. So anarchism, what we might call classical anarchism, arose largely in Europe and with white men. And so it has been over time critiqued from various angles, and I think generally deservedly so. And so one of those angles is feminist perspectives, that anarchists did not take a gender divide seriously or at all. And there's quite a bit of evidence to that. That's a very legitimate critique or claim. And so a number of women in particular were advancing feminist concerns within anarchism. So, of course, there's Emma Goldman, Voltairine, de Cleyre, and some others, but not all of them. Not all women within anarchism or more classical anarchism were necessarily bringing up women's issues. That was an initial strain with Goldman and de Cleyre in late 1800s or so, talking about women's liberation, that women needed to be as free as men. And a big part of this was sexuality, that free and open love and gender and sexual expression should be accepted and even encouraged as just a basic part of anarchism. So a lot of what I think the anarcho-feminists brought to anarchism was kind of the everyday and more personal aspects of anarchism also being social and part of the whole theory. There have been anarcho-feminists all along the way, and we could go back earlier than classical anarchism, and that would be great. I haven't really seen that much, but it would be really interesting to look at like pre-classical anarcho-feminism and see what might be there. There's still not a lot on anarcho-feminism. If one searches for that, there's very, very few works along that kind of line, especially in terms of books. There's a handful, I think, quite literally. Still seems a bit overlooked in the scheme of things. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's just not done as much. And so when Badachi's book came out, Anarcho-Feminism, this was a fairly sizable, dedicated book to the topic, which again hardly exists and has hardly existed since as well in the handful of years that have passed. And so what Badachi really seemed to be doing was looking, in a sense, at all anarcho-feminism, or as best as any one person could do that, but much outside of that, not just looking at anarchism or feminism or anarcho-feminism, but looking basically at radical social justice movements and looking at how we can bring them together and calling that anarcho-feminism with the focus on particularly the term Badachi uses as femina, which is Latin for women. So with the focus on, kind of women's roles, women's lives, women's liberation, but bringing a bunch of things together for the sake of what we might call total liberation.
So how does anarcho-feminism become veganarchafeminism?
I think the same way anarchism became anarcho-feminism. People realize there's more here, as expansive as even anarchism is supposed to be. I mean, I think and I understand anarchism as being against all oppression everywhere all the time. So basically anarcho-feminists said, well, wait a minute, you're not really against women's oppression. And so then vegans can read this stuff and say, well, wait a minute, you're not really against animal oppression, at least because I don't see it anywhere. And that is a fairly big omission throughout anarchist writings, is non-human animals. That's a pretty big omission lots of places, but it even exists in anarchism. And there's often even hostility towards animal liberation within anarchist circles, which isn't necessarily found elsewhere. Sometimes it's the leaving out of non-human animals is just more to indifference or ignorance, like just didn't think about it. But within anarchist circles, there's often explicit hostility towards it. of that animals are not an issue for us. We need human liberation. Part of that human liberation is often considered the right to use animals however we feel, because that's part of freedom, right? That's part of personal freedom, and anarchists like personal freedom. And sometimes I think above all else, and to a fault. And so people with animal leanings, animal sentiments can read anarchist literature and very clearly note the absence of non-human animals. And so that's what I did, is in reading Badachi's book, I loved it. But as someone with an animal studies background and that sort of mindset, is the general absence of animals stuck out. And so I knew this trend in general. I go over that a little bit in that chapter of key texts of anarchism and feminism and anarchafeminism that leave animals out, often completely. And so I note that this is a trend, and I noticed this basically in Badachi's book. But this is also pointed out as not a critique, and I try to position the chapter as an extension of Badachi's book. So in solidarity with Badachi, not against them. But my worry is that people could read a book like that, or really any radical theory that leaves out non-human animals, and think that they are being all-inclusive when they are not. Non-human animals are often categorically overlooked. And so that was the point, is just to say, look, if we think we're coming up with some sort of social theory of everything, and that's not Badachi's term, that's not Badachi's goal at all. So that's again, not an accusation. But if people think that's what they're doing, but they're leaving out non-human animals, particularly along the lines of veganism, like the actual implications of what it would be to include non-human interests, then in some sort of large theory, you have to include that. So that's at base all I was trying to say.
Something that comes up a lot, both in this chapter and one of your other chapters in this volume, which is about Black anarchism, is growing your own food. What's the significance of that for anarchists?
I don't partake in that, at least at the moment. I think it's one of the most wonderful things people could do. But to me, it's fundamentally, intrinsically anarchist. I mean, when one thinks about how dependent they often are, so most people in the world, and not really by choice, but are dependent on large external entities for survival. That's true for healthcare, it's true for food, it's true for basic repairs for like one's home or apartment, is that we often need others to help us just get by. And so even for like repairs for a home, if those sort of entities didn't exist or you couldn't access them, you're not going to be able to stay in that place very long. And that's a major problem. So growing one's food also emerged out of this vegan context, because I think that obviously relates to veganism. And I go over some of that in both chapters, that, I mean, growing one's food, just the term growing really refers to plants. And of course, myself, as someone who is vegan and promotes veganism, I would not raise animals. And so I don't mean that when I talk about, somehow procuring one's own food. So my context is the United States. And in particular, I think our food is generally unhealthy, not just in terms of what's available, but even the fruits and vegetables, the regulations over chemical use and what's allowed in them in various ways. So like the gene editing, the bioengineering that can happen and things, and just oversight is, I think, particularly lax here. And so I see that as a big, big problem. And so a way to circumvent that is to grow one's own food. Then you can control what you have and how you grow it. And when people take control of aspects of their lives, they tend to do it in ways that are beneficial for them. But also, I think those ways in general tend to be beneficial for others. And so part of growing one's own food, if you're growing plant food, then you are not confining and killing and eating animals. So that's a way to take attention off of those sorts of things. Well, not attention off of them as in not worrying about non-human animals, but it just automatically redirects attention in a positive direction that then kind of leaves those previously so-called maybe food animals alone. So it fits in with this idea of non-interference and therefore coexistence. This way, reliance on external entities, large conglomerates and whatnot, it can be reduced as well. You don't have to go to large store chains and buy food that is offered to you. And your food is more minimally processed. It's probably going to be have fewer chemicals on them. And this way you can use your own property or near property, maybe communal property, in ways that fit you. So things that are more curtailed to an individual's life or a community's life are inherently anarchist because it's not centralized. The plan and the use in that respect is not coming from external hierarchical authorities. It's coming from the individuals involved. So again, I think that's an inherent kind of anarchic component, and whether or not people identify with anarchism is not important if they grow their own food. But I think it's automatically there, whether they want it to be or not, and that's fine. They can take it or leave it. But the food aspect, I just think, is so fundamental to all sorts of life, to non-human life, so human and non-human life. But I think if there are community plots, then that's, I think, very anarchist as well in terms of bringing people together over this sort of shared goal. It's very mutual aid based, not charity based, and it's communal, so it's very social. You get people coming together, sharing things, and I think it's just wonderful experiences all around. That if people could do more of it, we would just lead better lives in many different ways.
I really like the sound of this, and I should say I do grow my own food, and that's something that brings me a lot of joy and a lot of value in my life, I guess. Even if I don't necessarily produce that much food, I'm very, very far from self-sufficient. But I suppose part of my worry in this conversation is I'm nervous about saying, oh, everyone should share the hobbies that I have. That doesn't sound like a very responsible thing to do. And so I suppose I want to ask, growing your own food, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of space. And I worry that people might reasonably say, well, there's better things I can do with that time, that effort, that space, than go out and grow my own food.
Yeah, well, and maybe there is. I wouldn't be a person to tell someone that's not true, right, of what they should be doing. So like I mentioned, I don't grow my own food, and that's something I wish I did. But so this is not me. The goal of promoting what I generally call urban agriculture in the chapters is not my way of saying everyone should do this, especially not as an insider, as like, I do this, so you should do this. It's very much on the other hand of, I have learned about others doing this and I admire it very much. So I just see it as an example. Here is a way we can really promote small group and individual autonomy and other things like health and connect it to animal liberation. This is just like a framework or something to point to, or a model of something that can have far-reaching effects that in the scheme of things is somewhat simple. It's just growing your own food. This is not some huge, framework, again, of like life sort of totality thing. Now, I understand growing your own food, especially enough of it, could start to consume a lot of your time and that sort of thing. But again, the point is not to tell everyone to transform their lives into certain ways. And I realize some people will not want to do that for various reasons. But so I'm from Michigan. I grew up close to Detroit, and Detroit has a long history, I found out partly through this, of urban agriculture and growing one's own food. So Detroit is a major city in the United States. It has had historical importance in the United States. It's up there with like Chicago in terms of, you might say, historical importance to the United States in terms of industry and whatnot. So it has been a very industrial city, and this is not the kind of place people think about growing your own food. Yet Detroit has a very rich and long history of residents growing their own food there. And in particular, that's from the Black community, and that's from its history. We are in the North, so Detroit in particular was a large destination of slaves who fled the South during slavery, and may or may not have gone to Canada from Detroit. But Detroit was a very big hub. And so if one looks at that history through Black literature in particular, again, not me saying Black history, but a lot of the slaves, of course, were working on plantations. They were working with crops. They knew how to grow food, whether they wanted to or whether they liked to or not. And so when they came to cities like Detroit, they had that knowledge and they could do that for themselves. And part of that was to live autonomously, right? As a way to not be under that sort of aspect of white rule. And so all that history is in Detroit, and a lot of that carries through to today, explicitly, sometimes not. But if urban agriculture can happen in a place, and to the extent that it happens in Detroit, then I was, again, just trying to use that as a model of, just in case people are reading this thinking this is unreasonable, I think we have a major case study here that shows it is very reasonable. And so there's at least, I don't think the reason of that's not going to work or I don't like it. It's one thing if people have other projects they want to focus on, and lots of other things can be important. But I'm just trying to showcase this as possible, as feasible, as multiply positive for humans and non-humans.
We talked a little bit before about how anarchists often don't extend their thought to non-human animals and don't embrace veganism. You write that anarchism is essentially veganism and veganism is essentially anarchism, at least in theory and ideally in practice. So I suppose, let me turn it around a bit. Do you think that all vegans should be anarchists?
Yes. So this is a thought. So again, this is not me saying, look, if you're vegan, you are anarchist, whether you like it or not. I wouldn't say that. To me, in theory, which is different from practice, that, yeah, veganism isn't veganism if it's not anarchist in spirit, and anarchism isn't anarchism if it isn't vegan in spirit. But that includes everything else. So with anarchafeminism, anarchism isn't anarchism unless it's distinctly feminist, and vice versa. And so, yeah, this is a claim that is made in the introduction, I believe, to the Coexistence book. And it's not given much room there. That was a beginning of this sort of idea. But since I have developed that into a bit more of a fleshed out idea, so I have a pocketbook. It's kind of a larger pocketbook, but that was also released by Active Distribution as like a companion volume to the edited Veganarchism collection. And so the pocketbook is called Veganarchism as well for a main title, but the subtitle is Against All Oppression Everywhere, All of the Time. And so that's where I really try to develop that idea, is basically any social justice issue has to completely encompass all of the other ones, or else it isn't what it says it is. And so I talk a bit about how that is difficult, right? This is not something simple to do. In fact, it's probably impossible, but to be against all oppression everywhere all the time, right? Like, we're just too enmeshed in things, and we're human, we can't be perfect. But basically proffering this as an aspiration, just as veganism has been proffered as an aspiration before, and I think that's an accurate way to portray it. But yeah, this was my attempt at kind of doing what Bodici does, is making this social theory of everything without being pretentious and actually saying that's what it is in terms of being like hard and fast, like the theory of everything, but trying to bring everything together and assert that everything must be brought together as often as possible, and as well as possible, and in the long term. So that's the striving goal. So yeah, I still maintain that. And I would say it applies for every sort of social justice movement.
Now, before we turn to our regular questions, I just wanted to address what might be for some listeners a bit of an elephant in the room. So you're writing about anarchafeminism and black anarchism. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I wouldn't describe you as a woman or as black. Is there a danger, do you think, in drawing upon these traditions when you're not part of the group whose perspectives they centre?
Right. So you would be correct in those sorts of identifications of me. So yeah, I would not identify at all as black. And even phrasing it that way sounds awkward. I would definitely identify as white. Gender, I have become completely indifferent to. So I don't think anyone would identify me visually as a woman or anything other than a man. But I own no label, and I would also refute no label. So people can take that as they will. Again, that's not a personal concern of mine. I really just shrug off gender personally. But so is there a danger, or could there be a danger in talking about these things? I think there definitely could be. People can do this insensitively. They can do it incorrectly. They could read certain literatures and get certain ideas and proffer those points forward that can be incorrect, sometimes intentionally so. I think there's also a lot of good that can be gained from this, from people outside of communities really trying to understand cultures and situations and peoples and identities that aren't their own. And I think this can be a big exercise in empathy and just general understanding beyond tolerance, but welcoming of diversity. I mean, it's well known in sociological literature that the more people interact with others who aren't like them, the more accepting they are to ideas and ways of life that aren't like theirs. I think that's an important aspect of things. I think also if someone erects barriers as who can study what or who can say what, that is automatically exclusionary, and that is something I am against. That is what Marquise Bay's chapter in the Coexistence book is about. And I know Marquise personally. I know a lot of the contributors from Coexistence book personally, and that's part of what makes that a very meaningful collection. But I've had conversations with Marquise about this. So I wrote a previous chapter on Black anarchism, and before it was published, Marquise has a book on Black anarchism, and I know, again, they're the one that I know personally, kind of in that realm. And so I talked to Marquise about that and asked them directly and said, is this something I should even do? They said absolutely, for the same reasons that I'm giving you now, that people, I think, should be trying to cross over, and you've got to try to do that respectfully, though, that realizing you're stepping into territory that isn't yours. So I think you've got to cede, for lack of a better term, authority and to experience, but not necessarily all the time either. I'm trying to remember the source. It was something, I remember the idea, which is more important, but that I read recently, where the author was talking about when the summer 2020 kind of resurgence of Black Lives Matter, you might say, in the United States was happening, that there was a lot of a call for listening to Black voices. And that, of course, is very reasonable, especially in that context. I mean, that should always be the case, but we should listen to other voices also. But how the call for listening to Black voices ended up kind of devolving into listening to particular Black leaders. And that was considered problematic because a small number of individuals cannot speak for entire communities. And so that's one thing I tried to do with the chapter on Black anarchism was I wasn't using Black leaders or large Black figures, people who have names that are recognizable. I was very intentionally looking at much more underground and obscure figures in that sort of scene and saying, let's look at what they're saying, right? This is a very different perspective. And I think that's what we should be looking for. So I think if people, try to navigate things in a respectful sort of way, but in a very passionate, to use a word from the Coexistence book, and genuine way, that crossing boundaries, so to speak, can be very generative and fruitful for everyone.
Now, Nathan, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes. So this is very vivid. It's the book Ignoring Nature No More by Mark Bekoff. And there's a story before that and after that goes with it. That was the first one, and it just took off from there.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, for publication at least, which was decently early on. It was a paper with Sarah Tomasello. So that was our first direct collaboration. And so the main title was Polar Similar. And it was about connections between basically anthropology and wildlife conservation. So looking at often the rift between human and non-human rights in those aspects, but then doing it in a way where we were trying to draw attention to how indigenous peoples and wildlife were similarly harmed by industry as well as conservation practices.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yeah, so kind of along the lines of what I was saying earlier is I would pick a much more obscure individual. And I think there are reasons for that. But who I would name is John Talent. So John wrote a book called How to Unite the Left on Animals. And they have done some other things. But John is a person who really has a knack for finding out topics that people aren't talking about and talking about them. And I think that's really refreshing and inspiring.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So I am somewhat hostile toward academics, both the individuals and the institution. So I think they could become less academic and more advocates. I think they do have a position and insight and abilities to really promote certain things. So I think they should be very vocal in public about their support for non-humans and more obscure topics and people and literatures. That's what I would really like to see, is more of an advocacy side, an outspoken advocacy from academics.
That's really interesting, and I'd love to push on that a little. Would you say that you are not an academic then? I noticed that you described academics as them.
Yeah, I would not identify as an academic. I certainly come from academics. You might say I have a foot in it, but I really like the intellectual aspect. That's what drives me. That's what drives me toward veganism and social justice. But I don't do what I would consider formal research at all. I'm not really into that. I don't even like reading it as much, like particularly empirical studies. And I just don't think I talk or act or write like an academic. So I do not identify that. I would identify more as an intellectual. I'm into like intellectual thought, but not in an academic, sort of formal, hierarchized and it's got to cut off from the public sort of way. And I view academics as all those things.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, it's probably unsurprising to listeners at this point, but I would say that humans should try to leave non-humans alone as much as possible. And that as much as possible could be qualified. The introduction to the coexistence book qualifies it, but that does not disregard positive interactions. But basically, if there's something we cannot do with non-humans, then don't do it. But if they invite us to interaction, then of course we can handle that with respect. But in general, let's try leaving them alone and see how far that gets us. I think it'll do a lot.
What are you working on next?
Well, so I have some minor things that I am particularly, focused on. So I did just come out with a little pocketbook again on Active. Active is one of those great kind of underground presses for people who are interested. But the pocketbook is called Against Cultured Meat. And so I put that together with my friend Richard Giles. And that is a collection of 3 critiques of books on cultured meat, cell-based meat. But that's a narrative that's presented very positively overall. And so we are looking at 3 books that do that present cultured meat very positive and critique them and try to point out what is not being said. So that just came out, but that relates to a future project because it's a small pocketbook, 3 little reviews. But I would like to do a second one where we review 3 other books and just kind of change up the contributions again, the way it's formatted, but evenly. So between Richard and I, and come out with the second one. So that's something I would like to do that Richard and I are talking about. And I also have a couple of presentations planned later this year on the same topic, on cultured meat. So coming up, the Arihanta Institute has a shared world conference that I will be presenting at. And so that topic will be on cultured meat and looking at it within various theories of justice and liberation in terms of what's proper treatment of non-human animals. And then later in the year, I plan on presenting at the International Association of Vegan Sociologists. And that should be on a panel with Richard Giles and another friend of mine, Vasily Stanescu, where we will all be talking about culture meat. And in particular there, I plan on looking at Bruce Friedrich's newest book on the topic and looking at his discourse and that of the Good Food Institute that he runs now, and kind of how that is promoting and talking about cultured meat. So those are the things in the works in the near term.
How can people find out more about your work?
Well, so that people have to go to a little bit more of older school techniques. So I am off of social media, so there isn't really anything to direct people to. You'll kind of people have to do it how I do it, and that is that I search websites or the internet, or I hear from other people. So I am pretty consistently looking at Amazon and seeing what new books are coming out in various words, various keywords and whatnot. That's probably the best way that people would have to do it. And it works for me. So hopefully that can work for others. I'm also happy to give out my email one way or another, and people can always contact me directly for any inquiries.
Well, thanks so much, Nathan, for joining us for this podcast. Yeah,
thank you very much, Josh, for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me all over social media too. My name is Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.